Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So, we continue to see the United States reacting to the leaked Pentagon documents that try to give information or have released information pertaining to the ongoing war. Now, this information that has been released does not appear to bode well for the Ukrainian side. Now, we know through the conflict that the Ukrainians have done a very good job at propagandizing the conflict. Both sides do that, obviously. But in terms of losses, in terms of battlefield defeats, in terms of personnel losses, in terms of equipment losses, the Ukrainians have done a fairly good job of preventing a lot of those losses from coming to light. Probably better than the Russians have on the propaganda side of things. Now, what's interesting in these documents is they talk about the possibility that the Ukrainians may start to run out of air defense missiles, S-300s, Buks, SA-11s, other systems that they're using against the Russian Air Force. Now, it's interesting to see the way that is positioned, that information is positioned, as if possibly the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition because they are using it against Russian forces. Undoubtedly, they are using these systems against Russian forces. Absolutely, it's happening. But what I don't believe is being talked about nor discussed about this leak of information is the other factors in terms of how these missiles and these systems, or how the Ukrainians are running out of these missiles and systems. And that is because the Russians are striking rear area supply depots. So yes, the Ukrainians are indeed using these air defense systems against Russian aircraft. Sometimes they hit Russian aircraft, sometimes they don't. The Russian Air Force has adapted over the course of the conflict where it is now conducting standoff missions against Ukrainian targets. And I've talked about the use of glide bombs, long-range missiles that the Russians have and are continuing to produce. But more importantly is the strikes by these Russian aircraft, by these Russian cruise missiles, by these Russian ballistic missiles, drones, against supply areas where these missiles and systems are being held. We've heard about deep strikes by Russian forces against targets in western Ukraine. That has happened. Now, what are those targets? What are those targets? What are those strikes going after? Well, one of those target sets that the Russians are trying to identify and then destroy is Ukrainian supply depots. And I have a feeling that that release of information that we've seen, recent release of information, where it talks about the Ukrainians running out of missiles, is because the Russians have hit those supply depots and areas where the Ukrainians are holding those systems. So very, very interesting to see how that is being positioned in terms of what the public is thinking because of what is being reported. The engagements near Bakhmut. This map, I can tell you right now, is not completely up to date. And we know now that the positioning on this map that you're looking at right now, and again, it's still, I believe, within reason, the best map that I can use at this point. But this map is not up to date. The Russians, in all probability, control all this area that is now in gray. Now, this map shows the Russian line through Bakhmut is just along the railway area, and then the gray area is being contested. It looks like, right now at least, the Russians have pushed Ukrainian forces out of the area near the railway terminal and the railway line that runs through the city towards the western outskirts of Bakhmut. So it'll be interesting to see in the coming days how this pans out. Again, I believe at this point, as I've talked about before, the Ukrainians are right now just attempting to get those forces that are defending Bakhmut out of Bakhmut, and that operation continues. It is the Ukrainians are unable to do a mass withdrawal from Bakhmut, again, out of concern of being targeted by Russian aircraft, by Russian artillery. In the south, it's the same sort of positional battle where we're seeing Avdiivka essentially start to be surrounded by Russian forces. And it looks like we're going to have a repeat of what is happening in Bakhmut near Avdiivka as well. The areas to the east of Avdiivka are very well fortified, so the Russians, again, are trying to maneuver around those fortifications and look to completely cut off Ukrainian forces. And look, you got a lot of terrain features to the west of Avdiivka. So again, these Ukrainian forces are at great peril right now of being surrounded and then being cut off by Russian forces. Another tidbit of information released from that Pentagon document release, and it's several dozen pages, hundreds of pages, indicates that the Ukrainian leadership in Kiev may be out of touch with what is happening on the ground in the eastern Donbass and areas near Zaporizhzhia. What I mean by that, it appears that Kiev, that the general staff, that the political leadership in Ukraine is attempting to quite possibly force an offensive that the Ukrainian military is not ready yet to do. Now, that could be both the fault of the Ukrainian army, ground forces, and the fault of the Ukrainian political leadership. Obviously, the Ukrainian ground forces, again, in the spirit of propagandizing this war, may be sending out information to the political leadership in Kiev that is not completely correct in terms of the operational capability of the Ukrainian ground forces. And that is leading the Ukrainian leadership in Kiev to discuss and talk about the idea of a multi-pronged counteroffensive operation, meaning that Kiev believes they have the capability of launching an offensive in the east, near Donbass, areas east of Kramatorsk, areas near Donetsk, while at the same time conducting another offensive operation with the stated goal of severing the land corridor from Russia to Crimea. Now, the Pentagon, in this release of information, has articulated to both the leadership in Kiev and the actual Ukrainian ground forces fighting on the front lines saying, whoa, wait a minute, time out. Let's take a time out. You may not be correct in thinking you have that kind of capability, especially given the Russian mobilization that has occurred. So the Pentagon is directing this at either the Ukrainian ground forces. I have a hunch the Ukrainian ground forces understands what its capabilities are, what it can and can't do. I also have a hunch that the political leadership in Kiev may not fully understand those capabilities. It may be signaling they are ready to bite off more than they can actually chew. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense for you, the viewer, as we attempt to cover this war. So that's kind of where we sit right now. I don't believe that the Ukrainians right now are ready for a major offensive operation. I think we're seeing the deployment of ghost brigades, ghost regiments that exist in places in Ukraine that simply are not ready. I believe that the Ukrainian military has the eventual goal of getting those forces ready for offensive operations. But ultimately, they're just not ready yet. Again, if you think about just the tanks that have been delivered to the Ukrainians, about 1 battalion of Western tanks have been moved into Ukraine. Challenger 2s and Leopard 2s. About 40 tanks total. That is not going to be the size of a force construct, an understrength brigade that is going to sever the land corridor to Crimea. It's just not going to happen. So again, I think we have miscommunication between the actual Ukrainian ground forces and the leadership in Kiev that is causing this problem right now for the Ukrainians. Obviously, the Russians are loving this, and in all probability, the Russians are preparing for a very large offensive operation sometime around late summer. Could be wrong, could be right. We'll see what happens. But that's what we here at MFAM believe is happening. So again, thanks for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. And as always, have a good day.